Good evening to you all and welcome to another Durham Castle lecture. For those of you who've come from a local school, we welcome you in particular. We have an amazing program of lectures here in this castle over the next several weeks. We have, for example, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, coming, who is a really extraordinary figure. We have probably one of the world's most famous intellectuals, Noam Chomsky, coming in May. So if your school wants to do a special deal with me, we can arrange you some seats at a modest price. Of course, it's free, but it'll be hard to get in, that one. So talk to me in advance. That's all right. Anyway, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Sebastian Maffettone, known to me as simply Sebastiano. I've known him for many years, and it is a great pleasure to have him here. I've always been at his institution in Rome, but now it's a great opportunity for me to welcome you, Sebastiano, here. Sebastiano is the university professor and dean of political science at Luis University in Rome. Luis University is one of two private universities in Italy. To say it's a private university matters in this case. It's not like saying it's a private hospital. Saying it in this case, it's a private university, means it's one of the two universities that works effectively in Italy. And it certainly does. There are some 10,000 students. It's the LSE of Italy in many respects, focusing on social science and humanities. No, Durham is not a social science university. Luis is. That's the thing. The comparison with LSE was only insofar as they concentrate on the same disciplines. Merely one side of a great corpus of knowledge, of course. He teaches political philosophy. He works on theories of globalization and the changing structure of the world order, but has a specialist interest above all in global justice, the subject, of course, of tonight's talk. He's been a visiting professor at numerous universities around the world. Sebastiano is committed to something very rare, I think, among philosophers, and that is to a dialogue between the Anglo-American traditions of thinking and those of continental philosophy. Actually, Sebastiano, you know, my own publishing company set out to do exactly the same as you do as well. But he's interested not only in a dialogue between Europe, as it were, and the Anglo-American world, he's interested also in the other traditions and discourses of thinking outside of the West. And that makes him a fairly rare philosopher, not just on the continent, not just in Europe, but anywhere in the world, someone who genuinely engages with different traditions of political thinking. In the 1970s, in this vein, Sebastiano translated John Rawls's major work, A Theory of Justice, into Italian. And for all you locals from the local school, John Rawls was the major figure of the second half of the 20th century in terms of political philosophy and political thinking. And A Theory of Justice changed the nature of political discussion around the world. It was an absolute landmark text of its time. And to translate it into Italian is to commit the great sin then of introducing this same debate into an innocent Italian context. Since then, Sebastiano and John Rawls have been almost indistinguishable in Italy, or rather, I should say so with more reserve, that Rawls's framework has touched many aspects of Sebastiano's lifelong research. And this research has led to numerous publications, too numerous to mention tonight, but also to an extensive public engagement. Sebastiano is often seen on Italian television, a rare philosopher engaging in public issues of his time and considered a rare thing in Italian political circles, a wise voice. His most recent book is translated into English by that most august publishing house, Polity Press, and it's entitled Rawls, an Introduction, fairly consistently, as it were. And tonight, as you can see, his talk is The Problem of Global Justice. So please join with me in giving him a very warm welcome.
David, thank you very much for this generous, perhaps too generous presentation. For many years in my life, I had the fortune and the pleasure to be a close friend of Ronald Dworkin. And once he told me that he had a dream. He was in paradise, a beautiful place with fantastic gardens, and in which they served beautiful martinis. And he was sitting on a table with illustrious personalities of the past. Then an angel went through and said, "Taisez-vous, Voltaire, now Ronnie must speak." The same sentiment, it's the one that I nourish today. I'm very proud to be here in this worldwide prestigious university, in this fantastic castle, and to speak with you, and introduced by David Held, a professor and a friend from which I've learned a lot in my life, and whose works on topics such as global justice are masterpieces in the international literature. Now let's see, I will use a PowerPoint presentation, not because I'm particularly a fan of PowerPoint, but because my English, as you understand, needs support. Visual support. This is, it would be better if I could read it, but anyway. I mean, as you know, in the world, there are people who died, 60% of the Italians since the end of March and the beginning of July. Then the beach comes and there is nothing anymore to do. And other that cannot eat. 20 million of people die by hunger every year. There are children who can study, as many of us, luckily, and others who have no access to education. There are patients who can be cured, and others that have no hope of any treatment. The tragic fact, the fact in itself is tragic, but it's moreover arbitrary, completely arbitrary. Merit plays no role in it. It all depends on where you are born. If you are born in Central Africa, you are definitely less fortunate, and the statistics quite evidently show that you have less opportunities to be wealthy. So, I mean, there is an evident problem of justice, and we feel that charity and beneficence are of course welcome and probably necessary, but they still are not enough. From this depends the urgent need of more global justice. The problem of global justice has two relevant features. The first is the one that I mentioned already. I mean, there are too many people that live below a threshold of poverty and deprivation, and there are too many that are wealthy enough. And this creates a classic problem of distributive justice. Also because, as I said before, merit plays no role in that, just a matter of luck and arbitrariness. But there is a second part of the problem, which is not even minor, that people agree that we need more global justice, but people absolutely disagree on the possibility of having more global justice. Basically, the problem is that institutions that can enforce global justice do not exist, that can make global justice possible and real do not exist. That's why there are wide disagreement. After the initial agreement upon the fact that we need more global justice, there is a huge gulf between people maintain that it's possible and people that maintains it's impossible. Today I'll try to address both issues. First, I mean, the fact of global poverty, deprivation, and deprivation as an obvious question of justice. We need more global justice. And second, and this is the main subject of today's presentation, the debate among different views about the possibility of creating global standards of distributive justice. I mean, to be clear, global justice is not only distributive justice. It can be cultural justice, for instance, people that can grow up within their own culture and people that are expropriated of their own culture because they are minoritarian and so on. And can be environmental justice because, of course, pollution can create problems of justice and so on. But today I will discuss only global distributive justice, which is already enough. I mean, this indeed is part of a book I'm finishing. The book is so divided into two parts. The first part is general theory, and it treats the idea of justice and to see how much different theories of justice influence your view of global justice. If you're Rawlsian utilitarian, or base your position on the capability approach, you will have a different version of global justice. Then it speaks about the relationship between political theorists and international relation theorists, which usually is not particularly good. And I think that's really silly, because you cannot have a proper theory of international relations without a political theory basis, and because you cannot construct a sound political theory of international relations without studying international relations. So the fact that the relationship is weak, to be mild, does not help in absolute terms. The third part discusses comparatively normative theories of global justice. This is the bulk of what I'm going to say today. And then there is a part of international legitimation that I will treat moderately today. My focus is on the third chapter of the first part. Second part are important application. I discussed the new regionalism, in particular Europe, as an exemplar model that's in between, and we will see afterward what I'm speaking about, cosmopolitanism and statism. Then I discuss war and humanitarian intervention. It's not human, it's humanitarian intervention. And multiculturalism, post-colonialism. But I will not insist on that. This is just the structure of the book. But the core issues of the book, by large, the most difficult chapters, the one that I left as last ones, because they are complex, are this one that I will discuss today, mainly the normative theory of global justice. What I try to do is to present a kind of sketch of these theories and proposing my version as the best of the one that I compare from a normative point of view. And then there is this problem of international legitimation that I think is the basis for which national entities, polities, states, call them as you want, are recognized, are universally recognized in the international arena as proper agenda makers of the international domain. My proposal, for lack of fantasy, I called it international liberalism, but the name is not particularly relevant. Of course, you can call it as you want. I'll try to present it in comparison with the rest of the agenda on about concerning normative theories of global justice. I mean, just to give a sketch of how I can arrive to what I call liberal internationalism, I can give you the different steps on my argumentation. First, there is a general presentation of the main theories of global justice from a normative point of view. Then there is a harsh criticism of cosmopolitanism. It's not aggressive, but is, I think, solid enough. The reason for which many political theorists today begin to doubt about the force of cosmopolitanism, I think, is in some way presented here. Then there is a distinction from statism. Given that I do not accept cosmopolitanism for reasons I will present today, of course one is tempted to say, this means that you are on the other side, namely statism. It's not. I think liberal internationalism, neither cosmopolitanism nor statism, is a different option. It's a topic, a classic topic of political rhetorics, to present two alternatives, which are usually a little bit made more extreme than necessary, to present our own position like the intermediate best, and more or less what I'm going to do today. And then I will present the two objections to cosmopolitanism that I call the institutional objection, the moral objection, and two ways to overcome, in my mind, these two objections. The human rights are supposed to overcome the institutional objection, and the idea of urgency in terms of sufficientarianism is destined to bypass the moral objection. This is the framework from which I derive my position. I mean, how to analyze and distinguish all normative theories of global justice? That will be absolutely impossible in proper terms, so you must schematize them. You can also imagine, keep your mind open for a kind of matrix. In this matrix you have two entries and, of course, four positions. As we will see, there are, in fact, no four positions, but three. But let's think of kind of two entries and four positions. Normative can be distinguished according to the ground for which we adopt them and according to the scope on which they insist. As far as the ground, the main reason for which we adopt the normative theory of global justice, we can distinguish relational versus non-relational theories of global justice. In few seconds, you will know what I mean by this. Perhaps you already know, but I will tell you anyway. And from the point of view of the scope, we will distinguish cosmopolitan and statist position. These are perhaps more clear and intuitive distinction. The first distinction is a distinction between relational and non-relational. It concerns the reason for which we adopt the normative theory of global justice. And relational theory are associative. They are based on membership. It's a membership in a group that determines the theory you select. Whereas non-relational theories try to avoid the membership-based approach. For instance, you can imagine as a relational theory, a theory for which membership in a state is the fundamental element for founding global justice, whereas you can imagine on the non-relational side the membership, not the membership, just to be a human being, like a condition. Everybody is included. The first, not everybody is included. It's like a clip. Membership means that someone is in, someone is out. In the second field, instead, everyone is in. Whereas the scope depends on how wide is the scope on which the theory insists. For cosmopolitan, of course, there are no boundaries. All the world is included in the theory. Whereas for the statist, the state is the only unit of concern for a theory of global justice. Now, these are two entries, so we should naturally have four positions in the ideal matrix we can formulate. I did not present the matrix because it's too stupid. It's very easy to see that there are two entries and four positions. But the real fact there are three positions, because there are no statists which are not non-relational. So we have cosmopolitan in both forms, statist, relational and non-relational. And we have statists, but only in one form. We have only relational statists, of course, because the membership is fundamental for being statist. So you cannot have a non-relational statist. Now, as I said before, one of the central points of my presentation is the objections consisted in presenting some objection to cosmopolitanism. Basically, I have two objections to cosmopolitanism. The first one is very well known. It's even trivial because it's the most common one. The second is a little bit more uncommon, perhaps a little bit sophisticated, so it's more difficult to perceive it. In other terms, the first is the institutional argument. The institutional argument goes against relational cosmopolitanism. So you know what is cosmopolitan. It depends on the scope you adopt for your theory, on what your theory insists. Relational means that you have to find a form of membership that bases your cosmopolitanism. Instead, the moral argument goes against non-relational cosmopolitanism. Let's take the first case, the institutional argument. I mean, relational cosmopolitans more or less say that in the world of today, there is already a network of institutions that more or less explicitly substitute what the state is within the nation. I mean, if the problem is beyond the state there is no justice because we do not have proper institutions, they say that institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, the United Nations, or more often the European Union, are institutions that in some way have the capacity to substitute the state and to exercise a kind of subsidiarity instead of the state. Instead, non-relational cosmopolitans say something very different. They say that given that we are all human beings, we should respect each other in a complete sense. We all have a dignity. That's why global justice does exist. Now, to relational cosmopolitan, we can object the institutional argument. The institutional argument says that even if it's true that in between the state and the world there are intermediate institutions. These institutions are not proper institutions like the traditional nation-state ones, because they have two evident failures. I mean, the obligation they give are more voluntary than the state. They look like benevolence and charity more than justice, and they are more arbitrary. So they are more or less more soft than traditional state obligation. That's why the institutional argument says, I will come back on this, but they say, generally speaking, that you cannot compare international institutions to state institutions. They are not only quantitative different, they are different from the point of view of quality, not only of the quantity. It's not only the robustness of them that is different, it's also the quality matters, and the quality is different. Instead, the moral argument says, look, is it obviously true that we are all human beings and we all deserve the same respect? But this is a moral or religious argument, not a political argument. And if we have a political conception, then we cannot adopt a kind of moral argument. Basically, what this moral argument says is that we are proposing, as directly political, a vision of the good, not a vision of the right. And if we are liberal Rawlsian enough, that minimum, we can say that we cannot force our moral visions upon common institutions. In some way, according to this objection, non-relational cosmopolitans anticipate too much the domain of right, which is already in the domain of morality and religion, but is still not political. To make it a little bit more sensible, less abstract, and I'm afraid less philosophical, think about, convincing taxpayers to pay more for global justice. It's very complicated. If you go in whatever democratic country and you are a political person and want to be elected and say to the electors, I promise you that we'll pay 5% more taxes because poor people in Central Africa deserve more justice, it's very difficult to be elected. So there is the need to convert the moral in political that not always non-relational cosmopolitans observe. I think there has been in the last years a very interesting movie, Lincoln, by Spielberg, in which this evidence is very well shown. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie, but the evidence is, of course, from a moral point of view, there is no doubt, at least for us. Slavery is simply wrong. There is no reason to defend slavery. Nevertheless, Lincoln does not operate only on the moral basis. He makes it political. He has to convince the others one by one, and sometimes even with means that are controversial, morally speaking, that he is right and they should vote for him. So he makes traditional everyday politics for making valid, politically speaking, a moral principle. I mean, in other words, it's not enough that you are morally right. You must convince people. You must get legitimacy for what you say, and political legitimacy depends on consent. You cannot be sure that you are morally okay if you don't convince the other people that you are right. That's the problem with non-relational cosmopolitanism. I mean, traditionally, at least 20 years ago, the majority of authors within the political theory of international relations and the global justice domain were from cosmopolitanism. I mean, still, my criticism of cosmopolitanism does not imply that I'm so happy with statism. And why? We must distinguish two forms of statism at least. There is a statism which is connected with traditional political realism. And this I do not accept for obvious reasons. I mean, I think there is a need for global justice, since I said from the beginning. That's why I cannot accept, so to say, a very traditional political realist hypothesis. But there is a more sophisticated statist, which is based on the morality of states. This is the statism coherent with a political conception of justice that goes through authors like Rawls and Thomas Nagel, and Charles Bates. And I cannot accept even this form of statism, because I think that we need a more substantial institutional support for our. I will try to see, in other words, I mean, traditional statism does not take seriously the problem of global justice. That's why I do not accept it. Of course, to discuss it seriously is more complicated, but my intuition is against for this reason. The morality of states view accepts the fact that people have moral duties of global justice, but still do not present them in the proper form. This is why I do not adopt this version. And they conceive, for instance, human rights only as limits upon the sovereignty of the states, but not enough. They said not enough to create what I call legitimation. Now, given that what I call liberal internationalism is ally, is neither cosmopolitan nor statist, how could bypass the two objections? Because of course I can endorse a third position, assuming that cosmopolitanism, I mean, a widespread version of cosmopolitanism is wrong because of one of the two arguments I mentioned, namely the institutional and the moral. But also assuming that, and assuming that for several reasons that I very sketchily mentioned, I'm against statism. And this makes intuitively more plausible liberal institutionalism. But still, I must go, sorry, liberal internationalism. But still, I must go through the two objections that I presented to the cosmopolitanism without, having a position able to defend itself from the moral argument, the institutional argument, the moral argument. Liberal international will not be better of the alternatives I presented before. I hope this is clear enough. And more precisely, and we discuss now these 2 points, to the institutional objection I respond with a peculiar vision of human rights, which is different from the ones given by morality of states. I repeat, for the morality of states option, the morality of states is an expression invented by Charles Bates that went through roles to create this expression. It means that a minimum of human rights is a necessary condition for a state to keep its self-determination. My position that human rights have a larger influence on international politics than that. I think that this position is sound enough. I agree with the fact that the states, to be considered a state in full sense, and to keep their autonomy and self-determination, must respect some human rights. But still, I insist that the global framework of human rights is more institutional than that. It's more than that, something more. I will discuss this later, so I stop here about that. To respond to the moral objection, remember, to match morality and religion instead than politics, I try to present a conception of urgency in terms of sufficientarianism. I mean, against the zero of total global anarchy and the one of full cosmopolitanism, liberal internationally present an intermediate options. As I said to you before, it's a classical topic of political rhetorics. You present two alternatives, try to present yourself in the middle. For traditional authors, I think natural law theories, for instance, is a classical example, but not only them, for many philosophical authors. Notwithstanding the progressive institutionalization, the fact that there is a legal status of human rights in the world of today, the main function of human rights, notwithstanding their institutionalization, consists in incorporating moral elements within the legal order. It's a kind of moral anticipation of a legal reality of tomorrow. I think that the legal reality, in part, is already existing and consistent today. And other people, instead, reacting to the moralization of human rights, I mean, according to the moralization of human rights, you have a kind of metaphysical vision for which there is, in your mind, already a vision of how human rights should be, and sooner or later, this vision will be legalized. This is against, not only a little bit bizarre, frankly, but also too moralizing. We need something more effective. That's why there is what we call normally a political conception that sees people like Rawls, Bates, and now several other authors, which present a freestanding conception of human rights, which means that the legal practice of international human rights is considered relatively independent from the morality. If you read that beautiful book by Charles Bates, The Idea of Human Rights, you have the idea that you cannot create a parallel mental reality of moral nature, namely absolute moral human rights before and then try to see how they are applied progressively in reality, but you must do the other way around. You must start from the practice, and this practice is stronger than people normally think. And it creates a kind of elementary, if you want, primitive basic structure. I mean, if justice cannot exist in the empty space, needs some kind of path dependence, some way, it needs some basic structure on which we can put our moral claims of justice. We can claim that the system of human rights in our world is the first evidence of the making of a kind of supranational basic structure. Is a kind of not properly finished or not completely realized basic structure of international nature. But this must take in serious consideration not the metaphysical position, the moral anticipation of human rights in our mind, but the practice, the freestanding practice view, the political conception, in other words, in which human rights are legal human rights as a system. And they are more effective than one can imagine. I mean, this is the main reason for which I do not accept the morality of states view. Do you remember I said that being critical of cosmopolitanism does not mean to fully accept statism. So this implies that one must distinguish his or her own position from statism. The way in which I do is twofold. On one side, I say I disagree with traditional political realism, because political realism does not take in consideration the claims of justice. The other argument is that even normative statism, like the morality of states-based statism, is unacceptable for this reason. Because according to people like Bates following Rawls, the function of human rights is simply to limit the full sovereignty of the states. As I said before, if you do not accept human rights, you partially lose as a state your self-determination, which is the basic principle of international political culture. It's the standard way from which we evaluate public political culture in the international domain. I say that human rights play a larger role. Not only they anticipate the basic structure, but they play a critical role in global civil society and international debate. I mean, if you examine the practice, I mean, remember the division between the moral vision of human rights, the one which is purely metaphysical, in which the existing human rights simply mirrors imperfectly in practice the moral human rights that exist in our minds. If you exclude this vision and you take the political conception, you start from the practice human rights. I mean, the real rights since 1948, UN Declaration, with all the documents accepted before, show strong evidence in favor of liberty and equality. They protect, from the point of view of liberty, equality everywhere, but they protect also equality from the point of view of welfare. So they are much less abstract and moralized than one could expect. They are most sensibly included in our version of the subject of politics, like free and equal person. That's why I think that the morality of states, in some ways, a too prudent vision of human rights. It does not include this much larger view of human rights. Let's go back for a minute to the political conception of human rights. As I said before, I say human rights, the system of human rights, as a precondition of international legitimation. I mean, human rights are not only constraints on the states from the point of view of their own self-determination, like the morality of states view says, but they also condition membership in the global society for individuals and groups. If you look to the real legal rights, called human rights, the ones that are altogether the system of human rights and that constitutes what is called the practice, these rights do not concern only states, but they concern individuals, companies, groups of every nature. And there is a kind of dual nature of the practice of human rights. What does it mean that there is a dual nature of these human rights, of this practice? It means that the states are the first ones that are supposed to make them observed. In this, I accept in part the vision of the morality of states view. The states are obliged to make the human rights realized. Otherwise, they progressively lose part of their sovereignty, of their self-determination. But at the same time, if the states are not able to do that, human rights become elements of a larger global community concern. That's why there are two steps. Now, so much for the institutional argument. So we cannot accept a direct transformation of global justice in the kind of justice like state justice, because there are no intermediate institution of the force of the traditional nation-state institution at world level. Still, we can believe in the system of human rights as the first example of freestanding practice of political nature in which legal rights create constraints upon not only the states, but upon also individuals and groups. But now I have the second kind of objection I made to cosmopolitanism to confront myself with, which is the objection based on urgency. I mean, I didn't find any word better than urgency. My example is clear. I begin with an example which is a little bit trivial, maybe silly, but it makes very clear what I have in mind with this word urgency. What's meaning in English, I'm not sure of, by the way. This is a good occasion to be. It's the first time I present it to an English-speaking audience. And my idea is something like that. The moral objection says in practice that you cannot convert your preferred moral vision into a political something if you don't go through a form of legitimacy that comes from public consent. Urgency creates a kind of exception to this. If you go outside the castle, and I wish it will not happen, and you find someone dying in the street, you don't need to go through a complex procedure of consent creation. You just act. So if you arrive in Auschwitz in 1945 with the American troops, you don't need to think so much about. You act. If you go in a place in which there is famine, you don't need to think too much. You do not have to transform your moral ideal in a political consensus. You just act. So urgency, in my view, is a way to bypass the moral argument, the moral objection to cosmopolitanism in a special situation. That's why I think that liberal internationalism, assuming the special case of urgency, can avoid the grip of the moral argument that instead attacks with force cosmopolitanism. There are, so to say, kind of duties of justice that are partially independent from the basic structure and the political conception I presented. The point is that these duties do not depend on the creation of a political structure. That's why they don't need the democratic consensus. They are not strictly relational, but they are not even of all humanity as such, like non-relational cosmopolitans do claim. They instead depend on natural duties of justice that we have in difficult and extreme situations. So I'm sometimes confronted with rare extreme cases, we can react directly instead of going through politics. I mean, when there is urgency, these actions and the duties corresponding to them do not violate the moral arguments, because they do not make appeal to controversial moral views. Why should we go through consensus, like Lincoln in the movie I mentioned before? Because, of course, slavery is morally unjust, but people in the United States that time were not convinced of this. So to be politically effective in democracy, you need to have the majority of the consent. And you must be in a regime of pluralism in general. You cannot base your political action on your own moral view. But what I claim is that in case of urgency, this general principle of liberal democracy is not valid. In some way, there are cases in which the right and the good are not different. If you act on urgency, if you help the people in the street who is dying, you don't need to distinguish the good and the right. In that specific moment, the good is not different from the right. So you do not commit a sin of violated liberalism if you act on the good. When you help directly the most deprived and poorest people in the world, in such a way you do not offend liberal democracy, you do not contrast pluralism. That's why in case of urgency you can do that. This is the last step of my presentation. I mean, one problem of urgency is so conceived that it's very difficult to put limits on it, to know when you are supposed to act on it and when you cannot. Sufficientarianism gives a kind of logical basis to the limits we put on our interventions in cases of urgency. I mean, we must consider that sufficientarianism is a very complicated doctrine. It was presented for the first time in a very clear way by Derek Parfit in an article in which it contrasted it with equality and priority, say that there are three different visions on the morality of politics. I mean, equality intuitively say that the more we are equal, the better is for the morality of politics. Priority say that there are interests, special interests that must be protected before the others and with preference toward the others. Sufficientarianism says something different. It says that we must raise the last ones. There is a threshold underneath which people cannot either survive or decently spend their life, and we must begin with that. So, in the response to the moral objection, liberal internationalism focuses on urgency, which means that global justice is addressed to alleviate the direst conditions of poverty and lack of basic rights, of course, at the global level. Which means that the obligation of global justice are much more limited than the obligation we have within the state. I mean, the logic of sufficientarianism is complex. There is a huge discussion in doctrine about how much we can rely on sufficientarianism and how much we cannot. But I think that intuitively it is very effective. If you want to convince the taxpayer to transform your moral vision in real liberal democratic justice, that they must vote on your right proposal, then sufficientarianism is much better. I mean, you can say, let's raise the condition of the worst off. Let's help people that cannot survive. But there is a clear threshold. I mean, clear is a big word. I mean, you understand that people, it's much more inclined to help people in very bad and dramatic situation. So my intuition that there is some correspondence between urgency and sufficientarianism. Urgency is a situation in which the good and the right, Giambattista Vico, the Italian philosopher of the 16th century, they would say convertuntur. The one goes in the other and vice versa. But sufficientarianism is a logical form in which this intuition can be realized. We are egalitarian nationally and sufficientarian globally. That makes sense in some way. It means that when inside the polity, we are more inclined to think that inequality is simply morally wrong, and that equality is in some way not only a means to a just society, but an end in itself. When we are in the global arena instead, perhaps it's easier to think that we must raise the level of people that cannot survive or something like that. So this creates surely a double standard, there is no doubt. But still I think it's much more plausible as a logical interpretation of urgency than egalitarian positions. Egalitarian positions, in other words, contrast too directly with the politics. Egalitarianism is perfect from a moral and religious point of view. There is no doubt. I come from Rome and must say that the Pope will endorse egalitarianism on a global level. But it's very easy in some way for the Pope to be egalitarian from this point of view. The point is to convince people, to make it political, like Lincoln in the movie. So I say that if we have these intuitions that human rights constitute a good response to the institutional objection, we can insist on the urgency as a moral response in which the right of the good are not so different, and that sufficientarianism captures some elements of the urgency solution. That's why liberal internationalism adopts in part sufficientarianism. To explain what this mysterious item is, I give a definition of sufficientarianism, for which sufficientarianism is the claim that what matters as an issue of justice is whether individuals have enough, whether they do not fall between a certain threshold of well-being. So there is an idea that we cannot tolerate that people in general fall underneath this threshold. Above this threshold, duties of distributive justice lose their stringency. They capture less our imagination, if you want to put it in a very mild and generic sense. They are less important to us. What counts for sufficientarianism, of course, are the worst condition of deprivation and scarcity. Of course, sufficientarianism presupposes that we have an idea of what this threshold is, and I don't think we have a clear idea. In the literature on sufficientarianism, there are plenty of paradoxes in which sufficientarianism can bring us. Paradoxes that philosophers like and other people detest. But paradoxes like following one: there are 10 people that can be saved by a doctor, but the condition in which out of 10, 5 can be saved. But only one would reach condition of minimal satisfaction. Does this imply that the doctor, being sufficientarian, should kill 4 for saving only 1? And all these paradoxes, it's a very controversial theory, what I want to say. I don't want to indulge in the technical philosophical discussion on sufficientarianism. Sufficient to know that I use it for explaining a position which is already complicated. I made a classical philosophical error to explain what is obscurum for what is obscurius, which is already complex and dark, which is something which is more complex and darker, which is not a good strategy. But still, I think that we have a general idea of what I mean by threshold. And the threshold is the human rights social minimum. That's why I think that two ideas, in some way, converge to present liberal international as a plausible proposal. If I'm not wrong, and human rights bypass the institutional objection, and if urgency is a good way to capture our intuition toward the moral objections, sufficientarianism seen as the social minimum of human rights, of the system of human rights, that, don't forget, says a lot about liberty and equality, so about our form of life, is an important way to reconcile both items and to make of liberal internationalism at least a consistent proposal. Thank you very much for the attention. which must have been very difficult with my poor English. I appreciate very much. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, Sebastiano. There'll be a large number of questions, I'm sure, on this controversial subject. I'm going to take questions tonight one at a time, which is we usually take them in clusters, and that's because we're filming this event as we do all the lectures here, and we don't have a roaming mic, so I'm going to repeat the question, because I have a mic that each of you asks, so it sounds banal. You ask a question, I repeat it, and then we go to Sebastiano's, because I'm trying to ensure that we capture it. So let's start at the front and work backwards. So if I can repeat that clearly and slowly. Handful. It's a test, actually, a good A-level test. Can you repeat these questions? Number one, is sufficientarianism just as expensive in the end as egalitarianism? And aren't the demands that it entails as difficult and as controversial as egalitarianism? And secondly, do you overstate the nature of egalitarianism in liberal justice? And isn't that itself a form of sufficientarianism? A star?
Yeah, I could hear a version, so I was. I begin my answer from the second point, which was in some ways easier, even if a little bit codard. A little bit too philosophical, in the sense that, of course, I speak of equality in principle, not in reality. So at the nation-state level, in the majority of the world nations, we are egalitarians. If you read, for instance, the Italian Constitution, the Article 2 and 3, Article 2 excludes discrimination, Article 3 is in favor of equality. And this more or less happens in many, many documents like the Italian Constitution all around the world. So, in principle, we are for equality. Perhaps we are not, in fact, I'm sure that we are not egalitarian as a matter of fact, but this implies only that we act in a way which contrasts with our ideals and constitutional principles. So we are wrong when we are not in some way. We are morally wrong, I suppose. So we should not be anti-egalitarian like we are, in fact. And again, statistics show that the world becomes less egalitarian than before. It's not necessary to read Stiglitz's book on inequality. So how enormously inequality increases in the US and in many other nations of the world. This creates an enormous problem, of course, because you cannot build philosophical theories independent from what happens. But still, given that the level at which I'm speaking is normative, I can conclude this by saying that ideally we are egalitarian. So if we are not egalitarian in practice, it's just something we should condemn and change if possible. The first part is more complicated. There is a long, well-known article by Paula Casals in which she discusses the three options I gave, the one given as first by Derek Parfit, namely prioritarianism, egalitarianism, and sufficientarianism. And she concludes, examining the paradoxes of all three positions, if taken in isolation, that the best solution is to have a kind of eclectic theory in which you use a little bit of the three items. Still, I think that if one of the arguments we should give is something that is effective on our moral intuitions in some way, sufficientarianism captures something, let's say, I put it in a very direct and a little bit exaggerated way. I am utilitarian in my family because I know the tastes of the person that live with me and with my friends. I am egalitarian at nation-state level because I don't ignore what people want, but I want more equality as possible. And I am sufficientarian at global level because I know that the level of sacrifice people, and probably myself, are disposed to do is less intense than elsewhere. So in some ways, an epistemological problem. The more you go distant from yourself, the more you ignore what people want. And so you increase the level of prudence in some way. And that's possibly this distinction makes some sense. Still, theoretically speaking, you're right. It's very difficult to compare.
Do you want to come? Now that's a hard one to summarize. Basically, if I capture it, isn't the argument about urgency the argument from one way of acting in the world, one practical way of acting in the world. And does it not, to say that to eclipse the view that it's only one way of acting in the world, doesn't that remove from view that there are a variety of different ways of practically engaging? Yes, from the same moral source.
Yeah, I mean, I have a twofold answer to this question, at least I hope. The first is, would I have spoken in Italian, probably my objection would have been more mild. It's the other language that forced my objection to be clear. So in some way it was a kind of rhetorical effort I make to speak for a language that pushed me in that direction. But it's not only that, that's one of the elements. The most substantial element, I think, is of different nature. There are two problems with the moralization of human rights and international politics in general. Let's take human rights to give a clear example. Assuming that I think that human rights are very important to understand what global justice is about, there are surely moral claims that are not included in human rights, and there are human rights which do not represent moral claims. So, I mean, the idea to say that you have a proper human rights, you have to have before a moral right, and then to embody it, so to say, in a legal right, I think does not work properly. That's why I think that we need to separate a little bit two things. This is the first argument. The second argument is the classical one of the political conception confronted with a moralized conception. It says, to be very direct, that politics matter and matters more than anything else in global justice. When we speak of justice in general, we cannot put it only on the moral terrain. We need a transformation of what is moral in what is political. That's what the Lincoln exams should represent in my mind. The fact that you are right, the fact that your moral intuition, your moral vision, your moral proposal is the best from a moral point of view, is not enough. That's why I think we should try to convert the moral into political, to make it, and again, for the Pope, for Mahatma Gandhi perhaps, which did both things, by the way, and for the Dalai Lama it's not a great problem. They can claim that all people are equal and all human beings have the same dignity, and I am completely in agreement with them. But to use this in a very general sense, urgency, the idea of urgency in some way limits the field in which you can reason that way to very limited cases, very extreme cases. So in the standard cases you act politically, so you must convert morality in politics, and in the extreme case you do the opposite.
Can I just follow that up? I just don't buy the argument that acting urgently avoids the moral argument, because the parable of the Good Samaritan is precisely an argument about how you deal and should deal with urgency. We know from the practical everyday world that people walk across the road all the time and avoid what they see. We know from practical politics that there are humanitarian emergencies all the time, and the few that come to our attention are subject to the gaze of a mass media that brings the attention. We know there's suffering all across the world, but we eclipse it all the time in order to get on with our everyday life. So the urgency act is a moral act that requires a discursive justification. Urgency itself doesn't carry it.
In some way, I agree with you. I mean, it's clear that there is a kind of circularity in the argument, but still, no, but I mean, still, I think there is a difference. I mean, according to non-relational cosmopolitanism, the moralization of global justice is the standard, where with the urgency solution is the exception. And that, I think, it's important, because, I mean, standardly, we cannot operate at nation levels, for instance, starting with urgency. But singularly and in extreme cases, we can. That's the argument. I don't think, I mean, it solves all the problems, but I think to accept some minimal natural duties implies that usually obligation of global justice come from institutional duties. Only exceptionally they come from natural duties that individuals have, because sometimes, I mean, institutional justice cannot cover all cases in practice. That's the idea. I mean, there are extra duties and there are natural duties of justice because the institutionalization of justice, for which I opt, sometimes is not enough.
I could come back on that. I would like to, but maybe later. I know there's more people on the front row and we haven't even got to. Yes, let me just take a question from Emma and then move back to the quiet middle and back of the audience. So this is a question which basically says the emphasis on urgency bypasses the problem of global justice, because global justice is about a system that creates poverty, and as the system that creates poverty may do so in a routine way, and when does this system of justice shine light on poverty of sufficient urgency that it acts, and if it only shines light on sufficient urgency, occasionally doesn't it eclipse the whole structural core of the problem of global justice?
Thank you very much, Emma. Very good questions. Unfortunately, good questions usually create bad answers. You know whether I will, but I hope to present my best answer. On the first topic, I had the fortune to have discussed the point many times with Thomas Pogge. Thomas Pogge, in many articles and books, and especially in this book on poverty and human rights, maintains that usually we are more or less consciously adopting a double standard. Because, as you said, injustice does not happen, it's created. And it's created precisely by those international institutions I claim should save us from injustice, not only urgency, but also the international institutions. So if these international institutions, like World Bank, International Monetary Fund, United Nations, etc., the system of international institutions creates the injustice, how should I think that it should provide a solution for the injustice it normally creates? This is the question that Pogge always put on the table. I think that here there is a problem. I mean, we do not know who is responsible for radical poverty, famine, and all these things. I mean, it's not given that it's the international system. According to majority of the economists studying the problem, the causes are internal to the country. It means it depends on the political and social culture of a single country, how much is able to provide economic and social solutions for the problems of the country itself. The classical example is South Korea and Sudan. They were more or less the same when I was young. They were more or less, a couple of centuries ago, they were more or less the same level of income and wealth. And now there is a huge difference. South Korea is a rich country and Sudan is not. It's a poor country like then. Why it is so? Because, I mean, the investment in moral capitals, the capacity of being deliberative and bold by South Koreans were much superior. And this does not depend on the international system, because the same international system made possible the wealth of South Korea and the poverty of Sudan. So in some way it was neutral to them. So the idea that the international system is responsible, it's at least controversial. I mean, in a very rough intuitive statistic, I would say that 80% of the economists claim that the internal causes are more important than the international system. But that's, of course, I'm not sure, it's not my... Still, at least it's doubtful. Well, so one can say that I'm addressing the second argument. The one about urgency and who decides what is urgency. Of course, not only Crimea now, but Iraq was a clear case in which there... I have a complex theory that I developed in that chapter on human intervention I listed on the board before, which I say that the justification of intervention is not enough. Urgency can be a justification, a moral claim concerning the fact that you are right in intervening, but you need also legitimation in some form of international consensus. So I don't think that urgency is enough to intervene anyway. But it's clear that the way in which Putin uses urgency now is, to be mild, I mean, a misinterpretation. So I would not say, perhaps, I mean, I said at the beginning, but I'm not sure about my usage of the word urgency. perhaps is not the best word, but what I mean is that when someone needs help, sometimes you can bypass, and it's very clear, because the problem is also epistemological. Sometimes you must be liberal simply because you cannot help people. I mean, you cannot know what preferences of people are. But when it's very clear, because they're dying by hunger, for instance, so there is not much space for interpretation, they need to eat. Perhaps you can be more effective from the urgency point of view. That's what I mean. Of course, does not cover cases like Iraq and the Crimea.
So the question is, what is the role of global trade in tackling global injustice, and have you considered global trade as an agent of global justice?
Thank you very much. Also, this is a very interesting question. I mean, according to many lawyers, and Professor Schutt could tell us something maybe if he wants, private international law is very important to determine the pace and the sense of international relations. I mean, coming from Rome again, I feel obliged to speak a few words in Latin periodically. So lex mercatoria, as the lawyers call it, is a very important element of a Pacific world, and so I think it's a force of civilization. Still, I think that all private international law must be included with a system of human rights that, in general, kind of quasi-constitutional system that from before regulates limits and the ambit of this. That's why I don't see the conflict between the two. I think you are definitely right, but human rights are, so say, prior constraints to the action of private international law and lex mercatoria in some way, at least in my vision.
Is your characterization of supranational institutions in some way, does it overlap with the English School of International Relations?
I dedicate, as I said, a whole chapter to see how much global justice theories that are standard now element of political theory, which means political philosophy in the department of political science, basically, must confront itself with international relation theory. And surely the English school is very important from this point of view. I myself consider particularly important Bull, and which, by the way, originally was a philosopher. And perhaps is this the reason for which I understand a little bit better than other colleagues. But in that vision, I think that we have an institutionalist view which is very interesting. I mean, many liberals are for institutionalism and for legal theory as the basis of their vision. And I think that Bull is the most clear from this point of view. In general, if we confront the English school with part of the American school, from Wilson to Princeton scholars like Slaughter of the last years, I must say that generally speaking, the British school exhibits more prudence, which in this case is a very good requisite. I mean, for instance, ultra-liberalism, as Slaughter, can be taken by neocons to justify the intervention in Iraq, for example. I mean, the British school results cannot, in my mind. Generally speaking, it seems to me that the British school presents a more acceptable equilibrium between the state requirements and prerogatives and world justice. That's why I think it's important from this point of view. But more than that, I'm not an expert of the British school, as you understood from my... Still, I think that it's a way Marxists are for explain everything with economics. Liberals prefer law. From this point of view, at least Bull is very interesting for liberal internationalists, because it's in this... Moreover, the position in between statism and cosmopolitan is very typical of that kind of approach. That's why I like it very much. Yeah, I mean...
Is global justice, just to repeat
exactly
the
question, in this last...
I lost the moment. Go on.
In this last... sorry, I was thinking about...
No.
In this last slide, I try to say that there is a kind of general social minimum that does not concern only poverty, and this is generally captured by the human rights system, also legally. And of course, slavery is incompatible with it. So I think that sufficientarianism captures some elements of it. It's not that they say anything goes. No, it's in conflict with slavery. At least I hope so. Otherwise, I retire my.
A final question from me. I would like to say something on behalf of cosmopolitanism, being that I am a cosmopolitan. There's another institutional story to be told and another moral story which yields a different basic structure. And the story, for your sixth formers here, goes like this. The history of the state is partly a history of brutality, reaching its height in 1939. With Nazism and then fascism and later Stalinism. But going back in time to early modernity, the idea of the modern state was often associated with the concept of sovereignty as absolute power. And that meant might makes right in law. And the history of empire and colonialism is the use of this concept that might makes right to justify empire and colonialism. You couldn't accept the indigenous rights of peoples because they were there already. So sovereignty then becomes not based on indigenous rights or something like that. It becomes based on, can you demonstrate your possession over a territory? So sovereignty is effective power. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, there's been a great shift and a struggle around sovereignty as effective power to a concept of sovereignty now embedded in international law as rightful authority. So the concept of sovereignty as absolute power has given way to a concept of sovereignty as legitimate if and only if fundamental human rights standards and democratic values are upheld. And in the international arena, this gets articulated for all its difficulties through the doctrine of R2P, humanitarian intervention, and so on and so forth. This shift away from statism only makes sense in light of the fundamental cosmopolitan values of the primacy of the equal moral worth in each and every human being and centrality of individual agency, self-determination, and so on, which find their articulation on the other side of this story in the struggle over human rights, international justice, crimes against humanity, and so on, which, as Bobbio most elegantly, one of your great Italian political thinkers as well, most eloquently put it, raises international values to a level that trump those of the state. This is a great story about power, shifts in power, and the transmutation of authority away from the state to the domain of individual, cosmopolitan, universal values. That is a basic structure. Strip away the institutional arguments, strip away the moral arguments, and you end up without a terrain of global justice.
Thank you very much.
For your benefit.
Give me a couple of hours to think about a good answer. But I mean, I had the pleasure to discuss with Bobby this argument many times, and has nothing to do with directly with your. But still, Bobby was positivist. So I thought that there is serious law on one side, and moral needs on the other side that we cherish, but we never will respect. So in this sense, he agreed with you, as you said, but he was on the wrong side, because he thought that human rights, more or less, were enthusiastic forms of goodwill, nothing more, nothing legal, no obligation, no consideration. The shift you mentioned instead presupposes obligation. And in my view, obligation presupposes institutions. Otherwise, it's difficult to explain them. I mean, what is the main sign of the shift? I think it's a very simple one. Let's say 60, 70 years ago, if the Italian state would have offended a British citizen, the British state could have claimed some reparation for this kind of offense. But if the Italian state would have offended an Italian citizen, there was nothing to do. Now, this is partially changed. The international community can protest against both kinds of offenses that are very different. I mean, This means that, in other words, what you say, that absolute sovereignty does not exist anymore. But this this shift, as you called it, I mean, opportunely, was created by huge war, by the experience of Nazism, as you said before. And why so? Because Nazism showed that the combination of political realism and legal positivism is impossible. Legal positivism, according to Dworkin that I quoted at the beginning, is the doctrine according to which law depends on the pedigree from which it derives. If you have a good source, you have a good law. And the Nazism, of course, showed the opposite, that you can have regular laws which are so horrible that you cannot accept them as laws. So, I mean, the history for which the shift happened, it's not only moral. It needed a war, it needed Nuremberg, it needed the Declaration of Human Rights. So all institutional actions that creates a new regime. But I don't think that to think it in opposition is correct. The best perhaps we can do is to think of them as a kind of, I use a word that now is not fashionable anymore, a dialectical conjunction, in the sense that moral needs create institutions, institutions create claims that have something immoral inside, and vice versa. I understand it's a very conciliatory way to answer, but I'm afraid it's late. That's why I thought it was a good way.
Well, we'll carry on over wine later. So you can judge the quality of a lecture partly by the quality of the response. A great lecture evokes from an audience great critical responses. So on that measure, thank you audience for great critical responses. Thank you Sebastiano for stimulating the audience, and thank you
very much. I will change the paper.
Magisterial presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.